Alright, good afternoon. Alright, welcome to Beyond Recovery, building the gap between community and disaster law. My name is Professor Letitia Jones, and in 2016, 83% of Louisiana parishes flooded. And so I wrote a grant to Equal Justice Works to create a disaster law clinic at Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And so, as they say, the rest is history. But normally I start off all my presentations by asking, does anyone know what disaster law is? And I get a room full of blank stares. But for the first time, everyone knows what that means, right? So it is a welcoming experience to be here and serve on the panel with our very esteemed panelists. And so I'm going to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves before we talk about how you can take your skills and go beyond volunteerism in order to impact our communities.
Great. Hi everyone, my name is Jeannie Ortiz, and I wear two hats in disaster relief and recovery. I'm a senior program manager at Pro Bono Net. We're a national nonprofit based in New York. And since the 9/11 attacks and Hurricane Katrina, we've supported disaster survivors by providing free legal help resources and also attorneys who are new to disaster relief by promoting resource sharing and networking. And also for the third year now, we're facilitating national CLE trainings to attorneys who want to learn more about this work. And then my other hat is I'm also Vice Director of the American Bar Association's Disaster Legal Services Program. And in that role, with other volunteer colleagues, we operationalize a memorandum of agreement with FEMA to provide temporary free legal services to disaster survivors where a major disaster declaration has been made.
Hi everyone, I'm Allison McLeary. I serve as Director of Disaster Recovery and Emergency Management Programs for Tetra Tech. Tetra Tech is a large publicly traded engineering company. We are a small company of about 27,000 people worldwide, but we have a burgeoning emergency management disaster recovery practice, approximately about 1,500 people throughout the country. So about half of what we do is direct response support for state and local governments, and the other half is grant management support and financial services also to state and local governments and certain critical private nonprofits. We help support over the years administration of FEMA public assistance programs, individual assistance programs, hazard mitigation, and the investment in grant programs that FEMA has made in resilience and mitigation hazards around the country. We help support those programs, as well as with some of the COVID stimulus dollars and recovery dollars that you saw over the past couple of years in the form of rental assistance programs, mortgage assistance programs. We even helped stabilize the child care industry in the state of Iowa with the bonus and retention program for child care workers. So we were really able to expand our reach throughout this last couple of years and support those state and local government clients that we've had. Some long time, some new clients, but state and local government clients throughout the country.
Hi everyone, I am Brittany Perkins-Castillo. I am the Chief Executive Officer at Ashford. Ashford is a Florida-based company that works nationally with offices across the country, and we are the largest company in the United States in the post-disaster debris removal and recovery space. And we've also grown significantly in the last couple of years broadly in emergency management and logistics. So I say our firm is a government solutions provider specializing in emergency management and logistics. So what does that look like? It looks like a lot of government contracting with cities, counties, states, and the federal government. A lot of work with DHS and FEMA, but other work with HHS when you look at migrants and the child migrant response. our work on the post-disaster debris side is the cleanup of major disaster events. So we're working in Southwest Florida, doing the debris removal, all the waterway and vessel debris removal and environmental work in Southwest Florida for Florida DEM/DEP. We're doing demolitions of homes that were impacted in Fort Myers and Sanibel. We did the entire cleanup in the state of Kentucky, which will be shown to be one of the most devastating and large waterway and flood cleanups in the United States. We cleaned up over 600 miles of rivers and waterways in eastern Kentucky. We're about to get started on the demolition. So that's the debris removal side. We also, and this is growing as you watch trends in emergency management from government, do a lot of the congregate shelters. So you're seeing a lot of governments move away from turning it to nonprofit partners. That might be the first place, but might not be able to given the tremendous amount of disasters in our country. So you're seeing a lot more private sector partners come in. So we had 2,500 bed shelters after Hurricane Ian, and I could go on. So that's a little bit about what our company does, and I'm excited to offer a private sector perspective and really the perspective of how to, emergency management is public-private partnership. So I worked for the AG and legal aid in a previous career, so in good company with you all.
See, it wasn't lip service. This is a great panel, right? So we want to talk about, I'm going to move up so it's not such a game show type of environment. We've recently seen this increase in both size and magnitude of disaster. So what I would like for you ladies to do is describe how you would really just list the current state of disasters and how we can kind of meet some of those needs.
Okay, all right. So one of the things that I want to acknowledge first that one of the things we're doing at Pobarna is that we're shifting from the term disaster response to responding to climate emergencies or climate-driven emergencies to acknowledge the fact that more and more of these disasters are happening and also intensifying and impacting our communities. In terms of the current state of preparedness, I was actually doing some research around this before this week, and I learned that when I discovered that the FEMA actually conducts a national household survey to look at the culture of individual disaster preparedness across the United States, and they look at people's behaviors and attitudes when it comes to disaster preparedness. And I thought it was interesting because the 2021 National Household Survey showed that the peak of self-assessed preparedness occurred in 2019. So I think that was like right after the major disasters in 2017, 2018. Many of us experienced Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico and across other areas, Hurricane Harvey, wildfires. So I think it makes sense to see that from 2019. But then in 2021, that number, so in 2019 it was 59% of adults in the US said that they were prepared for disasters, and then in 2021 that changed, went down to 44%. And people said that, one of the things that influenced that 44% figure was awareness, because many people had seen, read, or consumed information about disaster preparedness. So I think when we think about, how we are preparing our communities, that is really indicative of, I think the work that we still need to do, or find other ways to improve that communication. And there's an opportunity for us to encourage that disaster preparedness. I think when Puerto Rico, before Hurricane Maria, a lot of people were not expecting, Maria to be such a life-changing and altering event. I remember people telling me I didn't even think to take money out from the ATM because I never knew that the power was going to be out for so long. And now, 5 years, 6 years later, there's an emergency alert and people are lining up on the supermarket and just lining up to get things out and prepare because of that impact. And I'm going to I don't know if you guys want to add anything else about the disaster preparedness, but I have other things about the current disaster response.
Well, mine is actually briefly, I think, touched or related to what you said. My thought on the current state of affairs, taking a glass half full approach, is that it is, I find that emergency management has become more part of the dinner table conversation following COVID, right? People know in communities, and so I'm curious, everyone in the room, but from my experience, it seems more of a colloquial item in communities. And you are seeing more cities and counties, school districts, utility co-ops, either hiring emergency managers if they didn't, and putting out contracts. So I don't know if you see it, it's like nonstop government contracting in this space from every angle all the time, which I think is a response of governments looking to make sure they're checking the box across a spectrum of services for their community for response and recovery, at least in my view.
We are, and to echo that, absolutely we are seeing that. And we're seeing that in jurisdictions that we haven't before. In state and local governments that have never put out an RFP for the type of services that they found they needed over the last couple of years. So you see that happen sometimes with large events. In my experience, you always have it was Hurricane Andrew. When I first came in, was out the other people that I worked with talked about Hurricane Andrew as being a sea change in the industry. And then it was Hurricane Katrina, and then Hurricane Sandy. But then COVID really changed the game in a way that I think even surprised those of us in the industry. And that those events tend to prompt legislative changes, a review of kind of the whole framework of how we do things. And that's a good thing. And now I'm naming things happening every 10 to 15 years to really reevaluate how we do things, who we do it with, what the framework in which we operate is. And we're really seeing that with COVID. We now are seeing state governments who are big, capable, very well-funded programs go out and actually put out RFPs and get contract help, get private sector help to support. They're seeing some unprecedented retirements, a lot of COVID burnout, but in addition, it woke them up to think that it's not just going to be the ice storm that they may get every 4 or 5 years. It's not going to be. It may be a pandemic. It may be a terrorist attack. It may be those the other hazards that may be in a plan that's on a shelf gathering some dust, but it really woke them up for them to realize that they may need to call upon resources that they have never had to in the past. So we had the opportunity to be chosen for a couple of those jurisdictions, and we're really sitting down with them, and they are reevaluating the framework in which they respond, who they respond with, who their stakeholders are, who are the communities that they need to serve that they haven't served in the past. It really is a reevaluation of what we're doing now.
Well, I'd say even this conference, right, is part of the current state of affairs. My understanding, the first time this conference is or one similar is being held. And I guess not to harp on this message, I'm passionate about it. I would encourage, from the legal aid side and the nonprofit side, the current state of affairs really is an increase in government's looking at private sector partners. And so I think that's really important to be effective in working in communities that your clientele that you're passionate about. I've been a lot of different organizations and legal aid in this room. Knowing that shift is happening, I think is really critical to allow you to be successful.
And opportunities for partnership. Absolutely.
So I'll piggyback on that and talk about how inclusive we are now starting to see our agencies and policies, from FEMA offering translators to having multiple forms in different languages, to seeing more inclusive, vulnerable populations at the table represented in that whole community model. So segueing into that, seeing that we take FEMA as this whole community approach, we're seeing this increase in private consultant, nonprofit, non-government agencies assisting in disasters, especially in the response area. What are some opportunities you feel attorneys or advocates can kind of partner with these agencies in the next 5 to 10 years?
So that is actually how I started in this role. And so knowing that there is a growth in that, and I think there is more opportunity, more awareness of the need for legal services to support government, to support private activities, to support private nonprofits. There's an aspect of bring your own lawyer to the table. And that can be a good thing. I know some people cringe when they say that. Everyone in this room should understand that that's a very positive thing. In my experience, it enables decision makers to make decisions more quickly, to whether that's just a trusted advisor role for you to sit side by side with your leadership, with a mayor, with an emergency manager, for them to just get some immediate feedback as far as a decision that they may make. We often bring a different perspective, and that's a perspective that they need, and especially in that moment, they are not going to think of the considerations that you will. You absolutely bring a unique perspective. you have a unique voice, and you often have a strong voice. I mean, we are not wallflowers. Wallflowers don't often go to law school, and that voice is needed. It's an intense environment a lot of times post-event, and the need for a strong voice, and a strong voice that echoes regulatory guidelines and where those guardrails may be for those leaders. That's a really important role for us to play, and a unique perspective that we bring.
Someone else want to offer something on that?
Yeah, so I want to mention a few things that we think are useful, to consider. So we think about legal aid and nonprofits, what attorneys can do proactively on one side, and then what can we do reactively on the other side. So one of the things that we like to say and encourage, that we do proactively is creating a strong collection of legal rights resources that are available for organizations to quickly adopt and have ready for wide distribution. For example, one of the things that we did after Hurricane Ida was that Louisiana had a great collection of know your rights resources around FEMA, information that is relevant and applicable to different jurisdictions. And we were able in New York to quickly take information from that set of resources that they had created and then adapt it to New York. So I think there's a really good opportunity there. And one other thing that we did was, we developed this resource, Know Your Rights resource called Figuring Out FEMA in New York, and we met with a group of approximately 30 people who had survived Superstorm Sandy, and they told us, it's important for me to know, as a disaster survivor, what I need to do, who I need to contact. Having checklists is really easy for me to digest the information. So constantly, seeking that feedback from the community I think is key as well. And then proactively as well, this has been mentioned across other different sessions, but there are many resources available on data mapping. And one example that comes to mind is the Self-Representation Litigation Network. They did social vulnerability mappings for North Carolina, Florida, South Carolina, to look at the different areas and communities that were exposed to climate change and disaster and the impact of a disaster. So using that to inform what the legal aid organizations or nonprofits can do, I think is important as well. And then reactively, I'll add, I'll close with this, is monitoring how civil and human rights are upheld or not upheld after a disaster. I think that's a reactive strategy, and making sure that we have people collecting that information and collecting the stories that we hear on the ground to inform future decisions. There are many reports that document a lot of the disparities that we see in disasters, and I think it's useful to look at that information and think about how that will inform future decisions.
What other impacts do you see legal issues and disputes having on disaster recovery and efforts, and how can we address these effectively? So just for an example, we saw the Cajun Navy being turned away at the border. We're seeing some immunity issues that are coming up with cities being sued when decisions impacting them being flooded. So we're starting to see a lot more legal issues in all aspects of recovery. How do you think that will ultimately go?
I also say, I think it's interesting, Ernie and I were just speaking before this, and it's true, this is a really exciting area of law. The way you said it just kind of made me smile when you asked the question. It touches on so much, right? And I don't practice day-to-day law, and I haven't now for 8-9 years, but you get to do so much in this role. So as an attorney, I imagine, right? But I always say you get to touch, we're going to say constitutional issues very quickly. There's individual assistance and legal aid, individual versus community rights and stuff. It's just such a fascinating area. And when we talked about this question, where I went initially though, is like legal authority drives everything we do. And I echo kind of what you said. I think an attorney at the table in the city and county, state, it seems to give people great comfort or discomfort. I spend a lot of my days being like, I don't represent the company. I'm not an attorney. People don't want to talk to me. I'm like, I promise I'm not an attorney. But I think the converse of that is kind of what you said. People see attorney, and I think in a lot of the meetings in the emergency management space and see, okay, competence and competence. And so how do people in this room leverage that for the best interest of the individuals or community or issue area you're working on? But I think that the legal authority, everything we do in emergency management ties on who has the legal authority to do X and Y. And that's how all the money in the budget flows. And so being able to understand that for what you're working on and figure out which area of government you're going to push that issue, I think is critically important. And of course, attorneys and people that have been trained to read and think this way, whether you're practicing or not, is an invaluable skill set.
I think what continues to surprise me about that, Brittany, is after 20 years or in so many disasters, or 20 years of my career, but predated that, but it's still surprising to me that that question is asked every disaster. Every disaster, there's still a question as to some activity will pop up and there's still a question of who has the legal authority or responsibility to do that. It's a continuing theme. You would think that maybe all of those questions have been answered by now with all of the disasters that have happened over the years. It still doesn't. It pops up every time. And so and you were talking about waterways, or there's always an issue du jour, an issue of a disaster, and oftentimes it does boil down to legal responsibility. FEMA requires that before they'll pay for an activity or reimburse the government for an activity. They'll actually require you to show that it was your legal responsibility to have undertaken that activity. So a lot of times what lawyers in the room are doing is there may be even a survivor-centric, action, proactive action that a local government wants to take, and if it's not within their legal authority or responsibility to do so, there's oftentimes not a funding mechanism that flows to them for them to do that. And so, being able to understand those guardrails, those boundaries of what their legal responsibility is, helps directly tie them being able to undertake and pay for those activities. So a lot of times the role of a lawyer and me as a prior government lawyer was to try to identify a funding source to do some good work. And most of it is good work. And we still, on the consulting side, that's often our role, is trying to identify a funding source that we can tie to something that they're legally responsible to do to benefit that community, especially in longer term recovery.
All right. Allison, this is kind of a tie-on question. You guys mentioned that you've seen an increase in government contract. Are there certain areas of regulation that you're starting to see increased involvement in?
We're seeing a lot more planning. So part of what we do is not just nature of response and recovery, but there's also some preparedness planning and mitigation planning. So I'm seeing more local governments undertake more robust planning efforts. I think there has been some investment by FEMA in preparedness activities. Thank you, a refocus on preparedness activities. They just announced $2 billion for preparedness activities in the past month. And so there's access. So when something is well funded, we oftentimes see county and local governments take advantage of that. So we are seeing an increase in planning RFPs, just opportunities to help support government planning, vulnerability assessments, so tying it to a broader, bigger resilience and climate change and adaptation planning. We are seeing more of that. So it's not just traditional planning and preparedness that we've seen through FEMA programs, but they're taking a broader approach to vulnerability, not just being direct risk from natural disasters, but vulnerability to climate change and others. We're seeing in South Florida, for example, some RFPs include to do studies of heat studies and tree canopy cover studies, and not just sea level rise and things like that. So a lot more comprehensive climate vulnerability planning efforts is what we're seeing on the preparedness side. And on the response side, more so as well, more, like I said, states who thought, I have a staff, states who may have a staff of 200 people, a very well-funded and well-staffed emergency management department at a state level, thought they could handle anything, but when you get a large-scale pandemic response like COVID, plus 1, 2, or 3 natural disasters that may have happened on top of that, even a well-funded and well-staffed state-level robust program needed private sector help. And so we're even seeing some of the largest states in the country put out RFPs to get standby or actual real-time help with response and recovery.
I think I'll jump there. So very well said. We work in a different area where we're more on the response and recovery side, and maybe people in this room wouldn't be surprised. That's kind of my message. That is, I think people would be surprised by how much of emergency management is contracted out and is not managed by state employees. And I'm not saying whether it's a good or bad thing. It's for a topic for another time. And the reality is a lot of staff augmentation in the response and recovery side. So that's one place I've seen a lot. And so whether it's running the call centers or running shelters or hospitals post-disaster, keep going down the list. So, if you're, that's probably, I think it's a robust area for nonprofit partnerships. Nonprofit, I think government work really well together. I think in the non-disaster space, maybe corporate from a funding perspective, but I think there's a whole arena of nonprofit, private sector partnerships and planning and response and mitigation that really needs a lot of energy. And because again, emergency response is public-private partnerships. Where I've seen it, and more or less, like the 3 times I've talked about it lately, I brought this up, this is like my big issue right now. I think there's a really, and maybe because it's an easy, maybe low-hanging fruit example is congregate shelters, right? So my company, as an example, would be building all the congregate shelters. So it's crazy to me on the front end, and we've been reaching out to nonprofits. We've talked a lot with Save the Children. We've talked with an organization called Best Buddies that works with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We're building them. We already got the contract to build them. Here's what my floor plan looks like. You tell me on the front end how we should lay it out to best serve children and families, right? You tell me, right? We don't have experts on our team that on the social service or the humanitarian are experts in sensory issues for people with autism. So how do we best work with your organization and Blue Skies to plan out what the government is going to ask us to do? How do we set up an area where you can have legal aid there? So you have a congregate shelter of 1,000 people here. Your disaster resource center that the state's putting up is 7 miles away, not on a bus line. Like, this is really crazy, right? And there's a lot of ways that we all can work together. And I don't think a lot of times people think to ask the contracting side. And sometimes government, and I have tremendous respect. They were sitting in Florida. I think Florida DM's done a phenomenal job this go around. But sometimes the government is really burdened, so they don't think to make the connections either. So that's my message, connections.
Which brings us to our next question.
It's our business whole time, which is so awesome to echo that. Government's pulled in a lot of directions, even if you do have a focus. And so, because it is our business, we do have those resources, the time, the effort, and the focus that we do exactly why it is.
All right, so that segues us to, for those of you who are looking to get into this as a career or looking to partner with nonprofits or contractors, what are some skills that you're looking for disaster advocates or lawyers that they can develop, or law students, or even those that just want to kind of segue into contract?
So what I noted this is I think confidence and conviction, right? You're the expert in what you do, and you can feel confident bringing it to other people, whether that's government or the private sector. I think building bridges is really key. So I'll leave it at that for a second.
I think the recognition that you have a skill set that others do not have. I mean, you are going to be in a room with sometimes very seasoned, very loud emergency management government people running in a direction, but realize that you have knowledge that they do not. You have a role there. I was my very first one at 24 years old was Hurricane Katrina and thrown into the State Emergency Operations Center. And it was very loud, and I was very young, but I knew of certain legal parameters. I knew of certain legal, the EMAC, Emergency Management Assistance Compact, and no one had heard of it before. Just because, honestly, I had just read it the week before. I just found it in statute. But in that room of those professionals, I was the only one who knew what that even was. And at that point. And so just recognize that you do have knowledge that others don't. You have a perspective that is needed, and you have a voice, and you should use that voice to voice that perspective, because it's going to make the decisions better, the people in that room better. It's going to bring a perspective that will not be there otherwise.
Yeah, I have one.
Okay.
one more thing. I wish that organizations and legal aids and nonprofits, and I think you'll excuse me on the name, the speaker at lunchtime today, the professor, made me think of this when we talk about kind of community advocacy and pushing. I wish organizations, and it probably sounds crazy if you think someone in my seat saying this, but I really do. I wish organizations would push local government and state and federal, but like local government where you might be able to have an impact more to hold people accountable to certain standards. And I said it a little while ago in the session that was in here earlier. I wish our contracts required us to do more by the community. We do it as a corporation on a foundation side, but, and I said earlier as an example, one state, we worked in 22 states after COVID, did almost 2 million vaccines administered. One state required us by contract to participate with their public health access and functional needs task force. We were managing vaccine administration for multiple state governments, and no one by contract required us to meet with public health. I mean, that's ludicrous to me, right? We were proactively doing it. So I think attorneys, nonprofits, advocacy groups, a lot of the people in this room that have influence should be pushing the emergency management teams to bring some of that social equity and community and whole of community approach. Everyone talks about it, but when you start looking at black and white contracts to do this work, there's very little of it that gets put in there. Point.
Yeah, so I mean, my work is different, but I work at a nonprofit that leverages technology to expand legal help assistance and also network and support advocates working in access to justice related issues. So I think from what I've seen in my 5 years at ProBonoNet and also at the Disaster Legal Services Program, the skills that come to mind are, you mentioned that developing just really the expertise where there are gaps in disaster response, there will be a demand for that expertise, and also understanding the issues I think is helpful, or at least having an interest in understanding how the issues are impacting communities, especially communities that have been historically marginalized, and then also knowing how to use data and using that data, comparing it to the work that you're doing to publicly available data to understand where you're making an impact. We're always trying to use data to tell a story, to build a narrative, and see how it connects with what other people are talking about or how that is being understood by the federal government or state government.
I'm looking at Ernie Abbott here too, because I'm thinking too, one of the things that we often, just because we're just talking about this, but the attention to detail, and Brittany made me think of this in contracting, that it is just critical to a community to have proper contracting post-disaster, and that's where the legal eyes that are in this room can help communities. And you think that that's a very bureaucratic kind of just regular everyday legal work and contracting, but what the effect that it has on communities is that if those contracts don't comply with the federal regulations, with the local procurement ordinances and state law, that 4 years down the road, FEMA or the federal regulatory agency may come back and claw back tens of millions of dollars from that community. So it seems like, and at the time it will be a discrete function, it'll just be look at this 4-page contract and just see if it's compliant. And in the moment there's maybe someone literally breathing over you reading that contract. But recognizing that your role as a lawyer may affect paying for everything else that is happening and swirling around you, and that may be clawed back 4 years from now. That's a reality for state and local governments. We were talking about, there's a small community in the Panhandle of Florida that was actually having discussions about unincorporating, actually ceasing to exist because they were facing large clawbacks. Just the federal government process, the regulatory scheme that was in place was too complicated, and they felt too at risk that they were going to unincorporate and just reabsorb back into the county. Cease to exist as a city as opposed to navigate a federal regulatory scheme. That hurts my heart as a lawyer, it hurt my heart as a state regulator, and that's what we hope to prevent. I mean, that's community. That is that community ceasing to exist officially as a result of a disaster. And it sounds wild to think that a properly worded contract may be the reason why tens of millions of dollars are clawed back, but it happens around the country. every disaster.
So I'll pinpoint on this. One of the things that I tell my students is to understand, well, two things, ask and reframe. So you want to make sure that as you're engaging with clients, as you're engaging with contracts, that you ask questions. And then you reframe that question in the way that you understand it to make sure that as you go to enforce the contract, that everyone in that room and at the table understands the meaning of what is going to go into that contract. The second thing that I implore them to do is understand crisis lawyering. Okay? And that's important in our spectrum because you're going to have clients who are in crisis. Even emergency managers will be operating, they may not be facing the crisis, but they will be operating in an environment of crisis. And so we have to understand how mental health plays a part in us being effective advocates. And so some of you will bring in some social skills, nursing skills. I've had prior nurses that have gone to law school, and they bring all of those tangent things, right, that were in careers past into the present, and that helps them to find the voice that they're talking about. Find the opportunity, and that's where you can kind of revive your career from that. The next thing that we want to know is what role can attorneys or advocates plan for policy changes to improve disaster resilience at local, state, or national levels?
Oh, well, so, I mean, I think I would say start local. There are many organizations that allow or are seeking attorneys to volunteer for a specific policy project. Bar associations, for example, have committees, disaster-specific committees that take on this work to impact policy changes. And another example, this may have been already mentioned in one of the other sessions, but one example is the National Low Income Housing Coalition. They have a disaster recovery working group. They develop disaster-specific working groups after a disaster has happened to take a look at what the issues are, any issues that are happening in that disaster, and whether there's an opportunity to advocate for policy change, because I think that's in the aftermath of a disaster, that's when a lot of the stories coming and compiling that information is good for that advocacy. And the other thing is, I mean, bringing these policy questions to the law school classrooms as you're doing with your students. I never took a course on disaster law. I was in Puerto Rico, and I think that has probably changed by now. But I think it would have been really, really helpful, to think about these policy questions from the classroom, because I've only been learning this, for the past 5 years, and I think it's a great way to inspire students who want to do this work in the future, because a lot of funding is now going into climate change and disaster resilience. So that's, I think, a good opportunity as well.
Absolutely. A lot of our national organizations in more of the traditional emergency management and disaster recovery space do have student memberships. You can attend conferences, you can participate in those committees as well, that subgroups, and really getting to know the framework that way. Through those national organizations, the National Emergency Managers Association, there's state housing officials organizations. So whatever your passion may be, whether it's more in the response or the longer term or short or long term recovery, there's a national organization with that focus, and there's a role for students to play in that and to get exposure to those officials. I oftentimes, there'll be opportunities for internships and trying to find the right pick with the state or local government. I didn't know there wasn't disaster law as a class when I went through law school. It wasn't a thing. There wasn't, in fact, even the agency that I worked for at first said, I'm not sure what crisis response is. They called it crisis response. They said, well, we have 2 people assigned to it. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do, but you're assigned as their lawyer. Okay, we'll figure it out. But again, just So there are opportunities, still I think opportunities to craft an experience. And so with larger state or larger local jurisdictions, like we work with the city of Philadelphia, city of Houston, Long Beach, California, those are larger programs where they have set internship programs or internship opportunities. And have those conversations with them if you can craft the experience, not just be for your free labor or not just a placeholder there, but actually make a difference and explore an aspect of their program and explore an aspect of how they administer their services to their communities and explore that with them. I think there's those opportunities because I don't think that government, and especially the governments that are for us, very creative in thinking about that. And you guys as the next generation of legal advisors in this space, and you do have a unique perspective that most of the time they will not be hearing. So I think if you approach them and approach it as, I want to learn from you, but I also think I have a unique perspective. What are your priorities in the coming 1 to 5 years? And do you think I have a unique perspective, or do you think I have a perspective, or how get partnerships with the flexibility to bring that perspective to them and actually help influence the development of their program? Because I looked at my interns for that. I knew we were so far into, out of school and out of touch, quite frankly. Out of touch with our communities. You get out of touch if you have disaster upon disaster, you'll blink and you'll be 2 years out and feel detached from the communities in which you serve. And you guys hopefully can participate with those agencies and bring that perspective back to them or make them realize that. That's what I look for my internships to do.
And I think many ethics rules say this, but if you don't have the time to volunteer or work for a specific organization that does policy advocacy, we're also encouraged as attorneys to donate money if that's an alternative or an option to an organization that is doing policy advocacy. And I'm going to plug in this as well. If you're under 35 years of age or in your first 5 years of practice, you can also consider the Disaster Legal Services Program organized by the American Bar Association. We do a lot of work with different organizations across the country, but also take what we have learned from disaster legal services implementations in different jurisdictions and then take that back to FEMA. And I think that's another way to lift or talk about what we're seeing around and across regions to the main stakeholders in FEMA so that we're on their radar and they know that these are issues that are happening on the ground. So that's another way to develop a skill set that I think will be beneficial in the long term.
I agree with everything that's said, so I'll add just one item. Two items. One is fascinating. I said earlier, fascinating a law that you can touch so many different areas. So I just think law school courses, this type of conference is so important. But I think from a legal aid specific perspective, I have the pleasure of sitting through lots of city and county commission meetings. Thankfully, I've gotten away from that a little bit. And you hear people come up, and what I've seen some, and I've learned this myself, is like you're the expert in what you know, right? So you could rattle off your ABC soup of lingo in whatever your area is, whether it's FEMA or housing law. But so as legal aid, particularly, you have the power of people's stories. And obviously you need all the thoughtfulness around when you put a client and you ask them to share something that might be traumatic or vulnerable. So you're the expert to know when that's possible. But when you have a client that can go tell a story, get the attorney out of there, stand next to them, support them, from an advocacy perspective, I think the legal aid and coming back to the communities and the individuals be powerful. And there's a lot of money right now. It's hard to get, but there's a lot of states, Texas and Florida particularly, among others, that have lots of money that's going to be directed in this area. And I'm not the person to be cynical on if it ever gets to where it needs to go, but I guess encourage that storytelling and maybe try to pull on some of those funding strings that are ample in some states right now.
That ground, right?
Yes.
And really what they're just trying to say is if we have, for many of the legal aid services, by the time the disaster strikes, it overwhelms some of those services. And so you could do two things, really create an educated community. So on Blue Sky Days, have Know Your Rights. That way we have a consumer that understand what should be in their contractor's contract. They're just not giving disbursements out. We have an educated amount of people that understand what the resources are. Who do they go to once the disaster actually strikes? So that kind of lessens the burden on the front end. And then second, we have the opportunity to develop a pipeline, right? So law schools, we're developing this symposium. All of these things can help us once the disaster actually strikes. So we have reserved some time for comments or questions from the audience. So do you have any questions?
Question, specifically for our private sector representatives. In the areas where your missions overlap with existing nonprofits or volunteer organizations, do you see that overlap as, competition feels like the wrong word, but I'm failing to find another one. Is it competition or do you occupy a different space?
Yes, I think it's a great question. I have lots of thoughts, but do you have an example? So congregate sheltering, or do you have a different example?
Congregate shelter, debris removal was the first, I think that's the first thing you said your company does, so it's the first thing that came to my mind.
So it's interesting, and I love this conversation. I'm not easily offended by any means. So competition, great. I don't know. So I think where I saw it on the congregate shelter, right, that's usually when I first started, San Bernardino County, California called, and the call was, you're our debris contractor, but Red Cross said no, 7-Day Adventist said no, the Baptist said no, it was like a whole litany of people said no, can you come manage? Matt in our office, who you might know, this guy was, you want me to manage what? Volunteer, and it was, they just wanted volunteer. We did it, I don't even think we charged the county, but it was like the fairgrounds, they just were dumping volunteer, or donations, and they needed someone to come manage the donation. So is that a competition? I mean, no, right? The fact that government's moving that more in that contracting, I think is a concern, not in a positive or negative, but it's an interesting development that people in this room, I think, should be thoughtful of, and why is that happening? I think in a lot of spaces it's still oh crap, let's be prepared just in case everyone says no post-COVID. Allison mentioned the staff shortages. Government can't get people to respond. Nonprofits are having hard times. People don't want to travel the same way they did before COVID. And so I think time will tell in the next few years. A lot of these robust procurements that have been happening across the mitigation, planning, response, and recovery phases, I don't know if they'll be used, right? Maybe things will settle, but I think the response is that we need to have total preparedness. On the debris removal, I don't see it. I'd love a healthy debate if it's otherwise. There's lots of phenomenal volunteer groups that come into a community. The reality is, I think the volume of work, and oftentimes those volunteer groups, in my experience, are doing a lot of the going onto people's homes, dragging stuff to the street that we're not allowed legally to do anyways. Goes back to legal responsibility. I don't know of any volunteer group that goes in with thousands of pieces of equipment into community, within hours of a storm to supplement public works and solid waste in the capacity that our contractors do. And so I don't know that it's a competition. I think there's an interesting, I'm a big believer in the nonprofit sector and the legal aid sector, but nonprofit specifically, and again, big on partnerships. I don't think it's as simple when you start thinking of the amount of capital and resources on the front end. There's some groups, I don't know, Rubicon, I have respect for what they do. They're well funded. They probably could do it, right? I mean, some nonprofits are very well funded. But I don't know, there's serious insurance and legal and capital and environmental at the city, county, state, and federal level, environmental and regulatory expertise. So I don't know that the nonprofit and the private sector are in competition. I think they work congruent and certainly could do better. I don't know if that answers.
I agree completely. I think they're complementary. When we were in Kentucky after the tornadoes, I saw an unprecedented, in my opinion, response of nonprofit groups and just local community groups doing exactly like Brittany said, doing what government couldn't, putting it out to the, pulling that debris to the road, which is very complementary. It does speed recovery. It does directly help those property owners. So it's very complementary on that side. We saw that real time at a pace that I hadn't seen before there. And just terrific community in Bowling Green and Warren County just had terrific community support. For those large scale, and we actually did just win one of those, a large scale comprehensive services contract for an otherwise big capable area. We partnered with a private nonprofit for some aspects of it, for disaster case management and sheltering support and things like that. So we actually, as a large publicly traded company, partnered with a private nonprofit disaster case management provider for that scope area of that procurement. And so we're seeing that, and they're very, and I love them, and we partner with them stuff often, that they do have the expertise, but they don't have the people or the money or the funding, which we can provide. You know, the resources plus their expertise and their background in doing that, we're a very powerful, a much more powerful team than we could, and we actually would not be successful one without the other. And so we are seeing some states, the state of Michigan put out an RFP, a request for proposals for companies to do individual assistance administration, disaster case management after some flooding events. And they didn't limit it, oftentimes they'll limit it to private nonprofits. It wasn't anymore. There's going to be for-profit companies in that space, only because I think really because of there's tapped out. There's just not the level of resources. I think COVID really did strap the private nonprofit community as far as being spread very thin, and we are seeing state governments directly contract with for-profit companies for those services that which a private nonprofit used to provide.
Not to harp on this point, but I'll say one more thing. I wish people would call and ask more, right? So like we'll go and reserve, making up a number, 400 hotel rooms in anticipation. I've called the Rubicons and the Red Crosses of the world, or they'll call us and say, hey, we need hotel rooms. They're not necessarily always going to put that capital in the front end or have that. So I think there's actually just more opportunities to work together. I love, hey, here are the 400 properties that the government gave us to go do demolitions. Y'all want to start there? Because if you don't start there helping those people clear the properties, then we're just sitting and no one's getting anything done. So I think there's more opportunities to work together.
For debris, sorry,
No,
okay.
you and the
For the debris removal guidance, is that generally something included in the contract? And then whose job is it generally to communicate that guidance with people on the ground?
That's a great question. So I generally speaking, I think it's the cities and counties, public information officers, or the state putting out communications. From my experience, it's not usually, I think again, you're seeing more, the state of Florida hired a whole firm to help with public information during this last go around. So I think you're seeing more of that outsourced right to the general public. It looks like government, but behind the scenes, it's a staff augmentation type work. But we help with that where we can, but I think it's primarily a government function.
Hi. We are seeing more disaster law classes being taught at us, which is disaster law, teaching disaster law, and a while back I co-authored a disaster law book for use in law schools and other places, which were updated. My question is, I'm just wondering if just in just a phrase or two, if each one of you can tell me something that I should make sure is in the next disaster law book that we write. That is, or the t-shirt me or any of us, what are the one things we should, name one thing you should make sure that we make sure.
Oh, me. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was going
You're going to benefit from this too, that's what I'm saying.
No, I'm just playing. It's you guys. What would you, I can say what my students would like to see.
Yeah, what would they like?
So the students would like to see things that talk about client interaction, right? So we talk about a lot of the disaster law substantive issues, and they're okay with that, but when they're in the actual crisis and the client is crying in front of them, they don't have the receipts, their money has just been stolen, they're having that issue of dealing with the interpersonal, which is real conscious.
I mean, one thing that I would advocate for is language, access and justice, and how it relates to those, disaster response. I've seen, I don't like that sometimes in disaster response language access is kind of an afterthought. So we definitely advocate for that. And similar to what Letitia was saying, cultural competency, that it's really important. I would love to see more of that, practical strategy and guidance as a law student. It really helped me when I was doing my clinical work. And I think that's, I work in technology, so, and any connection or combination with technology and like how can we make, this is not so much, one-on-one interaction, but when we think about disaster law and how it's impacting our communities, how can we use technology, leverage technology to make data more accessible or information more accessible to disaster survivors, to lawyers, and how can we use that to also make our processes more efficient.
So I think I would add, or would think it would be helpful to add, I don't know if it is an aspect of, but the role of the private sector. That we are seeing, private sector largely fund, first 6 months of response activities, honestly. Like we are, and so I think in the staff augmentation, that's an aspect. So I think that the recognition that is truly a public-private partnership across the country into how disaster response and even recovery occurs, that it is largely, and that the regulatory scheme in place is not just the authorities found in the staff director found in these, state law that creates and identifies the roles and responsibilities, but there is such a significant volume of regulations and policies and just the quagmire, that federal funding, that you have to wade through to get the federal funding and keep federal funding is significant, and just the recognition of that. So it's not just roles and authorities, it really is the entire regulatory scheme thereafter, and just the difficulties that compliance, that you do face with compliance.
I like everything that's been said. I'm signing up for your course. Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it points actually kind of a good to your question. I don't know how many nonprofits could operate without being paid for months and months and months and months from the federal government. I've heard a couple other nonprofits have talked to us and asked our opinion on, I think people are moving like the accelerator funds where you have private businesses, like almost kind of like a big, I guess what's the word, like seed money, but also it's like between now, right, to where private companies can float that money for nonprofits. I think there's some really interesting, innovative ways to support the nonprofit sector in disaster response, because the federal government and then states and cities can take forever to pay you, and I really just don't know how many nonprofits, legal aid, etc. So I think there's some, so I guess the point made, I think that's a really interesting point. I think so pushing innovation and looking at ways you can do that floating and seed money. But I think, I guess, back to legal authority, which I know maybe we hampered on unintentionally here. I think, and kind of the first question you asked, emergency management, but with the climate, I think you said it's more part of the lingo in the conversation, right? As we've talked about, during COVID, a lot of people, I don't think, realized that emergency management, people in this room, I'm sure, did realize, but a lot of the general public thought it was a public health crisis. But really, for the first half of COVID, it was an emergency management crisis, right? So it was being managed, emergency management, FEMA, state government emergency management, with help and support from public health. But if you're a legal aid attorney or a nonprofit trying to get X, Y, and Z for your community, and you're banging your head against public walls, or public health's walls and office, and trying to get public health to respond, you're wasting your time, energy, arguably, because the people that were determining where the money went, which is probably what you were looking for, or the resources or the PP at the beginning, almost across the country was being completely controlled by emergency management. So if you go back to understanding legal authority and how things work, you probably can have much more efficiency in trying to get what you need for your client and your community because you're going to the right place.
So we have about 60 seconds. Do we have any other questions? Panelists, did you have any last words? All right, well, I would just like to thank you for your expertise and